Hey, Bene. Good morning, my relatives. It is Thursday, leap day, 2024, February 29, 2024. And I want to say Hey, Bene to everybody. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me for my second cup of coffee. There's a few things I want to talk about today, going through the news and just thinking about some things going on in our world. But before I begin, I want to do as I always do, which is acknowledge I'm on the traditional lands of the Piscataway. I live in Washington, D.C. with my family. Been living here for almost a decade now. Moved here from the Navajo Nation, and I am honored to be living on Piscataway lands. I am grateful for their stewardship of these lands. And I just want to continually remind myself to walk with humility on these lands stewarded by the Piscataway people. So, if you follow me and you are wondering whose lands you're living on around the nation, I'm going to share a link. I share this link fairly regularly. I don't know if I've shared it recently on my second cup of coffee, but I want to share it today. It's the link where I begin my research whenever I travel of whose land I'm on. It's native-land.ca. It's called Native Land Digital, and you can put in a city, a state, a zip code, and begin to look up the research for whose land you're on around the country. And it's not the final authority or the only authority on these issues, but it's a great way to begin your journey of understanding whose land you're on. I see Jermaine is on. Yat Abina. Good morning, Jermaine, Steve, and George. Yat Abina. Mr. Phil Fox, thank you for joining this morning. It's good to see everybody here. I'm grateful for those who are online with me. It's good to see all of you this morning. And you notice I changed the picture behind me. This picture is a picture I took last fall when I was in Anchorage, Alaska. And I had just flown in and I was going to my hotel, and it was right down not too far from the bay there. And so I went down, and there was actually several people out there kind of watching the sunset over the bay. And it was so beautiful, so peaceful that I went out there and I took the picture. So yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful picture. I think actually maybe we took that last spring. Sorry about that. I forget when it was. Fall, spring. I was in Alaska at some point. Anyway, so that's the picture of right at the water, right near Anchorage, Alaska, and I wanted to start using that as my background occasionally on some of my second cups of coffee. But so grab a cup of coffee. There's a few things I want to talk about today. Obviously, today is Leap Day, Leap Year 2024. And for those of you who do not know all the history behind Leap Day or Leap Year and why we have it, it's because the sun actually takes a little bit longer than 200 or 365 days to go around the sun. Or the sun, the Earth takes a little more than 365 days to go around the sun. And it's actually 365.256, I believe, to go around the sun. It's about 6 hours, a little more than 6 hours to go around the sun completely. And so we have a leap year approximately every 4 years. It's not quite that. There's some other math they do because it's actually a little more like 11 minutes over 6 hours, I think it is. And so anyway, so they do a little bit of math and they adjust it every 100 years. I think they skip a leap year or something like that. But anyway, I welcome you to read this article. There's a few interesting things in the article I just shared about leap year. And let me just bring that up. We've been using leap years for hundreds, a long time. Actually, a few thousand years. I think we've been using leap years, several hundred at least. Um, and one of the interesting things was that Pope Gregory in the 1600s did some more math to kind of refine leap year, because without leap year, the seasons and going on a lunar calendar of 12 months, and the lunar calendar is actually 11 days short. This is 354 days is in a lunar calendar. And so if you do a lunar year, you're 11 days short. If you do the calendar year, then it's 365 and it's a few hours short every year. And so they adjusted it back in the 16th century. And this is interesting because Easter was coming later and later every year, and the Pope did not want it to bump up against the pagan holidays. A lot of insecurity in the Christian church back then, and they didn't want the Christian holidays to bump up against the pagan holidays. And so they did some work on the calendar to kind of adjust it. Another interesting fact about leap year is about 5 million people worldwide are born on leap day. And so they only have a birthday once every 4 years. There's about 8 billion people in the world, and about 5 billion are born on January 29th. And it's been interesting how that caused actually problems for a lot of people, because when you enter in your birthday, and if it's on a year that doesn't have a 29th in February, it creates a problem in some issues like healthcare and a few other places. And so it's a unique situation for people who are born on the leap day every 4 years. Anyway, interesting article to read. I welcome you to learn a little more about leap year and leap day and some of the history behind it. There is so much going on right now. I found a new podcast that I listen to each morning. It's called Morning Brew, I think it is. And it's a daily podcast. And it's some people who kind of just go through and they talk about different stories going on. I've actually been adding it to my news feed podcast because I like the fact that it comes on daily. And I like the fact that it's a little bit of an analysis of the news. It's mostly financial news, so it's not just general news. It's a bit more slanted towards financial news. But I've been listening to that, and there's always a few interesting stories that come out there. And so they're one of the stories I've been following these past few days. This is not actually from that podcast, but this is just what's been going on in the broader news story. A few days ago, Trump was campaigning to Black people. And he stated that because of his criminal indictments, that is actually boosting his appeal among Black voters because they see that he is being discriminated against just like they are. He identifies with Black voters because a lot of Black people worked on his properties in New York, and so he knows Black people through his employment of them, apparently. And he apparently is, by his account, not by anyone else's, by his account, he is gaining support among the Black community because he is victimized much like they are by our criminal justice system. And that, of course, is laughable, right? It's absolutely laughable that he would compare his plight as a billionaire, or at least someone who claims to be a billionaire, and someone who actually was involved in an insurrection, is living in an absolute fantasy world about his own popularity or his own reality regarding winning elections and so on and so forth. Displays many of the classic symptoms of narcissism. And he is saying that because he is actually attempting to be held by our Constitution and by our courts to account for some of the things he did, that he is a victim just like Black people. And it's both laughable and absolutely insulting that he would make such a claim. Absolutely insulting that he would compare his plight to a group of people who are counted as 3/5 to this day by our Constitution, who are being incarcerated at an astronomical rate because enslavement is actually still constitutionally legal in our country under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. That he would compare himself to a group of people who has been enslaved, and Jim Crow laws and lynchings and all this massive, incredible violence at the hands of white landowning men. And Donald Trump is claiming he can identify with them, and he is gaining trust and appeal within the Black community because he is also a victim just like they are. It's disgusting. It's absolutely disgusting. The way that he would demean and belittle the plight of people of color in our country by comparing them to what he is experiencing. And to be honest, Donald Trump is not being held accountable by our criminal justice system. Right? I say this frequently. If President Obama did a quarter of the things that Donald Trump did when he lost his election, if President Obama did anything remotely similar to that, he would have been ousted from office and put into prison faster than you could count to 10, right? By a bipartisan group of people, right? White people would be absolutely terrified if a person of color behaved the way that Donald Trump is behaving right now. And they would use everything within their legal system to throw the book at that person and put them into prison, if not outright kill them. And Donald Trump is being allowed, not only is he not being in jail, his appeals are being heard and he's getting his day in court. He's playing it out as long as he possibly can. And if he thinks what he is experiencing is anywhere remotely close to what people of color experience within our criminal justice system, he has no sense at all of American history and of the plight of African Americans and Native Americans in this country. So, Donald Trump, you insult me. You deeply, deeply offend me by your ignorance and your narcissism. I find you to be a repulsive and insulting person. And I am deeply offended that you would even begin to compare your plight to the plight of people of color in this country. So anyway, that's one of the things going on right now. On a bit more of a lighter note, one of the other stories I've been following, I saw this in the New York Times the other day. And I want to bring this up because it's interesting. There is a Euro-Asian owl named Flaco, or there was, I should say, that was in the zoo in New York City. And apparently someone vandalized the cage or the whatever the owl was in, and the owl got loose. And it died after about a year. Apparently it captured the hearts of most of New York City, right? It was living out in the wild for over a year, I think it was. There was questions, how would it be able to hunt? It wasn't in its natural habitat. It obviously couldn't mate. There were no other owls like that around there. And the owl was resilient. Flaco was resilient. He was seen. He moved into Central Park about 2 months after he escaped from the zoo and lived there for about a year, hunted pigeons and rats and other things like that, and was able to live. He was sighted frequently by bird watchers and other residents of New York City. And then on February 2nd is when he got free. And he died not too long ago. The story I read was on February of 2023. Maybe that's when he died. No, that's when he was set free. He was on February. It was February 24 February 23rd, 2024. It might have been around the time that he died. But anyway, that's when the story was in the New York Times. And it was interesting because in that story, they quoted the Wildlife Conservation Society, which had put out a statement. And in their statement, they said the vandal who damaged Flaco's exhibit jeopardized the safety of the bird and is ultimately responsible for his death. We are still hopeful that the New York PD, the NYPD, which is investigating the vandalism, will ultimately make an arrest. Now, I am not for a moment endorsing vandalism of zoos. I'm not endorsing that for a moment. But it's interesting that the Conservation Society put the entire blame of Flaco's death on the vandal who did something to his encagement that resulted in the owl escaping and being able to fly free and live in New York City. They went on to say in the story he was able to avoid vehicles by sticking largely to rooftops, water towers, and other elevated elements of the environment after leaving Central Park last fall. But the risks that he would be killed in a building strike was great. As many as 230,000 birds a year die in New York City when they hit windows, according to the National Audubon Society. And that's how he ultimately died, is he flew into a window and he was killed that way. And so the fact that the Conservation Society would blame his death on the vandal who let him free and not share the blame for his death by all of society for the structures that we erect and the buildings we make and the glass-sided buildings that we put up that cause birds to fly into them. Not just Flaco, but apparently, according to this article, 230,000 birds a year die in New York City in the very same way that Flaco died. And all I'm saying, as someone who is indigenous to these lands and who sees the way that our very calloused way of living and erecting our structures and urbanizing our environment and the impact that has on the natural world and creation and the environment and the wildlife around us, to place all the blame for Flaco's death on the person who vandalized his encagement, and to not hold the rest of us accountable for erecting a society that results not just in Flaco's death, but in 230,000 birds a year is not accurate, right? That's not the proper perspective to have. I think all of us need to carry some of the blame for the way that we live in our world. That we've constructed a world and we do things where the only safe place for wildlife is in a cage. That's the problem, is we are quickly creating a world where the only safe place for wildlife is a cage and not living in their natural habitat or environment, because we're so quickly destroying it. And so instead of just rushing to blame our woes of this very public death of a magnificent looking owl and ignoring the 999,000 other deaths of birds that die in the exact same way, and say this one guy killed this one bird, but there's no mention of all the other ones who die, that's irresponsible. And so that story caught my attention, because obviously it's meant to make us angry and to say, yeah, we have to protect these birds. But, right, our job is not just to protect them by putting more of them in cages. It's to learn how to live more sustainably and to coexist better with the natural environment, so that we don't only have to put wildlife in cages. And we can actually learn how to coexist alongside them. But that's not how the New York Times sees it, apparently. So anyway, I put that story in there. I welcome you to read it. And it was an interesting story. One of the last stories that I wanted to share with you, and this was really interesting. I actually was first alerted to this story from that new podcast I'm listening to. It's the Daily Brew, I think is what it's called. But it's been in all of the financial papers, especially. Is Wendy's CEO came out, I think it was on Monday, and said that they were going to attempt to test surge pricing in their stores, with the advent of electronic billboards in the stores where you can see the menu and they can change things dynamically and very, very quickly. The idea was floated that Wendy's was going to try doing surge pricing in their stores of their food items. So when they were busy, they were going to raise the prices, and then when they were slower, they were going to lower the prices so that they could keep buying more consistent. Let me share this link with you here. And this story apparently this news got a lot of pushback from people. Obviously, many people are very upset about the fact that restaurants would actually try to start doing what Uber and Lyft already do, which is jack up their prices astronomically when there's a demand for their services, and then leave them somewhat lower. It gives you no sense of how much a ride to the airport actually costs, right? You have no idea what a ride to the airport actually costs. It is completely dependent on the time of day and what's going on in your city, and there's no kind of set rate of what a ride to the airport or a ride to whatever you want to go to should cost. And Wendy's was floating the idea of doing the same thing with burgers, where you have no idea what a burger actually costs. You just know during busy times it goes up as high as $6 or $7 an hour, and during slow times it's maybe down to even $4 or $3 an hour. And who would know like what the actual range would be and what the actual value of the burger would be? And so I'm very, very glad pushback went out on that. I would probably just quit eating at restaurants that started doing surge pricing on their food items. And Wendy's tried to walk back some of their comments, comparing it more to the dynamic pricing that hotels and airports do, right? Which is they just do it on a more systematic and slower speed. They don't change the prices as quickly or dynamically as Uber and Lyft do, but you don't know what the cost of a airplane ticket from New York to LA costs, right? I mean, it changes depending on the airline, depending on what time of day, depending on if it's a holiday or not, right? It's always changing. The same thing with a hotel. You have no idea what the actual price of the room is. It's going to change depending on demand. And you never really know what you're going to end up paying. And to see that begin the pricing in restaurants to become as dynamic, whether it's as less dynamic but still dynamic as we see in airports and in hotels, or as minute by minute like we see in Uber and Lyft, both of those are extremely unsettling. And so, yeah, I'm very grateful that at least they got pushback and they seem to have responded to some of that pushback. But a few things I just want to let you know, a few things I'm thinking about and I'm hoping to be talking about this next week. I am reading through the book for Black History Month. I'm reading through the book. I mentioned this a bit on Tuesday, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks. So very good book. I'm not close to finishing it yet, but I want to talk about it next week, probably on Thursday is when I'm going to have a discussion about this book. And so if you want to pick it up and read it at the same time and have some conversation about it, I'm planning to do that on my second cup of coffee next week, Thursday, that first full week in March. And I'll be talking about that. The other story, I read this the other day and I don't have a thought on it yet. I'm still pondering this story and I want to share it with you because it's about what's going on in Oregon, where in 2020, I think it was, they voted in Portland to decriminalize drug use, including a lot of hard drugs. And now they are dealing with an absolute skyrocketing rise in hard drug use addiction, like fentanyl and other things like that. And it's really causing the city to rethink its stance towards drug use and what are they going to do about it. And this is a really difficult thing to do, right? To know how to respond to. Seeing the destruction to both individuals and families that happen because of drug addiction, right? There really needs to be some way to control it and to compel people to not use drugs and to definitely not buy and sell drugs. but also the fact that it is the problem for people who are addicted to it. And that's not necessarily just a choice. There's a lot of things that lead to addiction. And so it's a very difficult debate. And I'm still trying to wrap my head around this story and just kind of get this more in my mind right now. So I'm not ready to say anything about it right now. I'm sharing it with you because you can read it, even throw me some questions about it. I'm going to try and talk about it sometime in the next week or two, I think. But yeah, I want to think about, I want to have a conversation about what do we do about the rising, the general trend of decriminalizing drug use, but that's leading to its greater acceptance and use throughout our society. And that is coming with a whole nother load of problems that go along with drug addiction and drug use. And so what do we need to do about that? And yeah, I'm hoping to have a discussion about that sometime in the next few weeks. The last thing I want to share with you, if you remember, I did a TEDx talk several years ago. It was back in 2015. I did a TEDx talk. And there's two places you can watch that TEDx video online. You can watch it on YouTube, and you can also watch it on the TED website. And so if you just Google Mark Charles, We the People, or Mark Charles TED Talk, you'll find the link to both the TED website where you can watch it and to the YouTube site where you can watch it. And it's not a viral video, but it's done fairly well, right? On the TED website, it has 317,000 views. And the reason I'm sharing this right now is on the TEDx YouTube channel, it has 299,800, and this was as of like 45 minutes ago, and 861 views. And so if you want to help bump that video up over 300,000, this is just a screenshot I took just a few moments ago. You can see down at the bottom, 299,864 views. That's as of about an hour ago this morning. It'd be fun just to see that go over 300,000. So, and have it over that number on both of those websites where it's visible. But also, it's a great resource. I actually get a lot of feedback from people who have watched my TEDx talk and say it's a concise talk. It's 19 minutes long, and it gives a very good layout of what the doctrine of discovery is and the way it's impacting our nation even today. And it also lays out my vision for common memory, as well as for building a nation where we the people actually means all the people. A lot of the themes that went into my 2020 campaign came out of what I articulated in my TED talk, my TEDx talk back in 2015. So it's a great resource. I often, when people invite me in to speak and they want to expose me to their audience before I get there, I often recommend that they share the YouTube video with them. I have a lot of people who told me that they've watched the YouTube video in their classes, whether it's high school or college or even just for things at different workplaces where they watch the video because it gives such a concise explanation of what the doctrine of discovery is. And so, yeah, if you haven't seen it, I invite you to watch it. I'd love to see it go over 300,000. That will happen sometime later today or tomorrow, but it's just, I thought I'd share that with you and let you know that that's a resource that's out there. But anyway, my relatives, I hope that your cup of coffee is as good as mine is. I hope you have a great weekend coming up. Let me see if there's any comments or things in the chat that people are saying. Susan, can we talk about Project 2025 in the future? It's a dangerous GOP leadership policy. I will research what Project 2025 is. I have not heard of that before, but I will take a look at that and make a decision if that's something good to decide to talk about here. Thanks for recommending that. If you want to hear me, if you have an idea of things that would be good to discuss here on my second cup of coffee, please, by all means, feel free to suggest them in the chat or in the comments. Feel free to email them from my website. I would love to hear input from you of some of the things that you would like to talk about during these times. I'm working hard to make my second cups of coffee a bit more consistent as well as a bit more dynamic. And so I've been playing around with some ideas with some of my team about what we can do to make my second cups of coffee more consistent as well as a bit more dynamic and engaging with people. I'd love to see this grow as a platform. You can obviously watch my Second Cup of Coffee on YouTube as well as on Facebook and on Twitch. I stream it live on Twitch. You can also we call it my Second Cup of Coffee to go. You can get it on the podcast website. Just Google my Second Cup of Coffee. You can get it from Apple Podcasts and Spotify and all the other major podcast sites. And that's a growing audience there too. I have in the podcast realm. So yeah, I'm hoping to see this grow and get more consistent in the next few weeks and months. And I'm in a weird part of my travel schedule right now where I'm home indefinitely. I do not have another speaking event scheduled at the moment. I have a few events locally, but when I look on my Southwest Airlines app, where I put all of my travel plans and my trips I take on, I have no pending travel right now, which I'm actually kind of excited about. I'm excited to be home for a few weeks or months. I know I already got one request the other day that will most definitely result in some travel coming up. But at the moment, I have nothing scheduled or planned. And so I'm looking forward to being home and doing some writing. I'm also really looking forward to being home and being able to engage more with my Patreon, as well as with my Second Cup of Coffee here on the live stream, as well as on the podcast. So, my relatives, those are my thoughts. Those are my plans. Hope you have a great weekend. Walk in beauty, my relatives. And may we all learn how to walk in beauty together. Asyahat and Hakone.